Ethan Carter had always believed that home was more than just a roof over one's head. It was a sanctuary built from memories and sweat. A decorated military veteran and now a respected city official, Ethan had spent years working for the community, ensuring that local government not only functioned, but also served its people. After his service, he found solace in restoring classic cars, a passion that helped him reconnect with simpler times. His modest, yet lovingly maintained, suburban home stood as a testament to hard work and independence. Every inch of his property, from the well-worn wooden porch to the meticulously manicured garden, spoke to a life crafted by determination. However, tranquility was about to be shattered. In this sleepy neighborhood, an unwritten rule was enforced by an unlikely tyrant, Kerren. As the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association (HOA) and the de facto leader of a band of entitled board members, Kerren ruled with a mixture of smug superiority and an overzealous sense of duty. Her reign was marked by an obsession with petty details and a readiness to fine any homeowner who dared defy her arbitrary standards. It began on a bright spring morning. Ethan was outside, enjoying a cup of coffee and checking over his prized restoration projects, when he noticed a figure approaching with deliberate, measured steps. It was Kerren, clad in a perfectly pressed blouse and a severe expression that made her look every bit the bureaucratic nightmare she was reputed to be. In one hand, she clutched a thick envelope of final warnings, and in the other, a clipboard as if it were a scepter. "Ethan Carter," she began in a tone that left little room for discussion, "your porch lights are far too bright. They're in violation of our community's aesthetic guidelines." Her voice was unervingly calm, yet every syllable dripped with authority that made even a city official flinch. Ethan, taken aback, replied, "I've never agreed to these arbitrary rules, Kerren. I just want to enjoy my home in peace." His tone was measured but firm. He knew full well that once you stepped into Kerren's domain, common sense often went out the window in favor of draconian regulations. Kerren's eyes narrowed. "Common sense? I'm afraid what you call common sense is nothing but disregard for the community's values. Consider this your final warning." With a dismissive flick of her wrist, she handed him the envelope and moved on as though concluding a simple transaction rather than launching a personal vendetta. Inside that envelope was not just a warning. It was the harbinger of an escalating conflict. Ethan's heart sank as he realized that the day would not be about enjoying a quiet morning, but about standing up against an HOA whose overreach threatened his very way of life. The home he had fought so hard to maintain was now at risk of becoming a casualty in a battle of wills, pitting a dedicated public servant against a self-appointed enforcer of outdated rules. Ethan's neighbors watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. While some had grown accustomed to Kerren's relentless inspections and fines, many quietly hoped that someone would finally put a stop to her tyranny. In the background, whispers circulated about past victims who had been forced to make absurd modifications to their homes, all in the name of conformity. Feeling both insulted and incensed, Ethan resolved that he would not back down. "I didn't sign up for this circus," he murmured to himself as he carefully opened the envelope and skimmed the legal jargon contained within. Each clause was designed to restrict his freedoms and place his personal choices under the microscope of an unyielding association. This was more than a mere misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan realized that his quiet retreat was now a battlefield. He would soon find that Kerren's petty offense was just the tip of an iceberg of absurdity. The HOA's reach extended far beyond regulating porch lights. It intruded into every aspect of daily living. In this new reality, a simple act of personal expression could trigger a cascade of fines, legal battles, and public shaming. Thus began the collision of two worlds: the independent spirit of a man determined to live life on his own terms, and the rigid, punitive structure of an association ruled by entitlement and triviality. Ethan's resolve was set. He would fight not only for himself, but for every homeowner caught in the crosshairs of Kerren's oppressive regime. The stage was set for a conflict that would test the boundaries of personal freedom versus bureaucratic control. The following morning, as a haze of early light settled over the neighborhood, Ethan found something unsettling taped to his front door, a $750 fine for violating community light regulations. The charge was as baseless as it was absurd. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the detailed list of infractions, a laundry list of non-existent violations that left him both puzzled and incensed. Standing on the sidewalk, arms confidently crossed and a smug smile playing on her lips, was Kerren. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she declared with a tone that brooked no opposition. It was as if the fine was an inevitable consequence of his very existence. For Kerren, this was just the beginning, a calculated move designed to send a message. Compliance was not optional. Ethan, who had spent his career upholding the law, was not about to be bullied by an overzealous enforcer. He calmly informed her, "I'm well aware of the community guidelines, and I'm also aware that many of them are neither logical nor enforceable." The calm authority in his voice was a stark contrast to Kerren's overblown theatrics. Without missing a beat, Kerren retorted, "I suggest you pay the fine immediately before the situation escalates. We wouldn't want to involve the authorities, would we?" Her insinuation carried a threat that was as subtle as it was chilling. That afternoon, the knock of inspectors at his door confirmed her warning. A couple of municipal inspectors, acting on anonymous complaints, began a meticulous survey of his property. They questioned every detail, from the height of his fence to the color of his trim, seeking any violation they could pin on him. Anger simmered beneath Ethan's calm exterior. He knew the only way to confront this injustice was to use the law as his shield. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the local zoning office," he explained firmly when an inspector inquired about the legitimacy of the fine. It was clear that Kerren's strategy was to overwhelm him with bureaucracy and intimidation. Yet, every step she took was a step closer to exposing the absurdity of her power. Throughout the day, Ethan began receiving supportive nods and sympathetic glances from neighbors who had long suffered under the HOA's oppressive measures. Some even approached him in whispers, confirming that Kerren had a habit of issuing fines and legal threats over the most trivial matters. Anything from the placement of a garden gnome to the style of mailbox chosen by residents. Kerren, meanwhile, paraded around the neighborhood with an air of triumph. Each time she passed by Ethan's house, she seemed to relish the power she wielded. "This is how we maintain order," she would proclaim, as if enforcing arbitrary standards were a public service rather than a personal vendetta. Her entitlement was absolute, and she believed her authority was beyond question. Yet as the day wore on, cracks began to appear in Kerren's facade. A local board member, known for his more balanced approach, pulled Ethan aside to express concern. "I've seen this before, Ethan," the board member confided in hushed tones. "Kerren's been using these fines as a way to line her own pockets and distract from the real issues. You should document everything." Armed with this information, Ethan's determination hardened. He started taking meticulous notes, photographing every interaction, and saving every official-looking document he could get his hands on. The $750 fine wasn't just a monetary penalty. It was the spark that ignited his resolve to stand up against an HOA that was designed to suppress rather than support. That evening, while reviewing his notes and the series of events, Ethan sat back in his worn leather chair, reflecting on how one man's stubborn refusal to submit could challenge an entire system. His mind raced with plans for a counterattack that would not only save his home, but also free his neighbors from Kerren's tyrannical grip. Kerren's power move had been bold, but it was also fatally flawed. In her overconfidence, she had underestimated the strength of community spirit and the resilience of someone who had dedicated his life to protecting his fellow citizens. The wheels were now in motion for a battle that would expose the corruption and overreach at the heart of the HOA. In the days following the fine, a palpable tension gripped the neighborhood. Kerren's initial show of authority had transformed into something darker, an overt campaign of intimidation. As Ethan continued to document every interaction, he began to notice a disturbing pattern. Neighbors exchanged furtive glances and whispered warnings about Kerren's notorious reputation. According to hushed accounts, fines would mysteriously vanish if homeowners contributed to the HOA's secretive funds. Rumors hinted that Kerren was diverting these funds for personal luxuries rather than community improvement. Late one evening, as Ethan sorted through stacks of correspondence and scribbled notes on a legal pad, a timid knock at the door startled him. It was Harold, one of the quieter board members whose conscience had not yet been completely numbed by Kerren's influence. In a low voice, Harold revealed that he'd seen discrepancies in the HOA's accounting. "Ethan, there's something rotten in this association," he confided. "I've noticed funds being siphoned off for Kerren's personal expenses. Repairs on her vintage car, extravagant parties, nothing that benefits the community." Ethan listened intently, heart pounding as Harold continued. With each word, the full scope of Kerren's corruption became clearer. Determined to expose the truth, Ethan set up discreet cameras around his property and began a detailed log of every instance of harassment. His investigation expanded rapidly, from the moment Kerren issued that initial fine to subsequent encounters where inspectors and officials seemed to appear out of nowhere. Each piece of evidence strengthened his case that Kerren was not enforcing rules, but rather using the HOA as a personal power grab. At the next HOA meeting, the tension in the room was almost tangible. Ethan entered quietly, file folder in hand, determined to present his collected evidence. Several board members shifted uncomfortably as he began recounting the timeline of events, from the excessive fine on his doorstep to the inexplicable surge in anonymous complaints. His voice, though measured, carried an undercurrent of righteous anger. "This isn't about maintaining order," he declared. "It's about control, and it's about using your authority to profit off the very people you're supposed to serve." Kerren, seated at the head of the table, looked uncharacteristically rattled. For the first time in what felt like ages, the aura of smug superiority had been replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Yet she managed a tight smile as she interjected, "These are baseless allegations, Ethan. You're misinterpreting standard procedures for personal vendetta." But the seeds of doubt had been sown. Several board members exchanged glances. One even muttered to another that perhaps they had been complicit in decisions that now seemed arbitrary at best. Outside the meeting room, whispers of dissent began to grow louder. Homeowners who once stayed silent were now emboldened by Ethan's courage and the emerging evidence of mismanagement. As the meeting broke up in disorganized murmurs, Ethan's mind raced with ideas for a counterattack. He began planning a public confrontation, a way to force the issue into the light and unmask Kerren for the fraud she truly was. Every documented incident, every overheard conversation, and every dodged inspection became a stepping stone in his unfolding strategy. Late that night, while the neighborhood slept under a blanket of uneasy calm, Ethan sat at his desk and drafted a detailed timeline of the HOA's actions. His pen scratched furiously as he recounted each encounter, each sneaky power move by Kerren, building an ironclad case. It was no longer just about one fine or one petty rule. It was a full-scale corruption of power, and the community's trust was at stake. The HOA's escalation was now inevitable. Kerren, desperate to maintain control, would soon resort to even more extreme measures. And Ethan, armed with the truth and buoyed by the support of his neighbors, was ready to fight back and expose the rot at the heart of the association once and for all. It was a morning that began like any other, but would soon turn into a scene of quiet chaos. Ethan awoke to the sound of machinery outside. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, he stepped onto the porch and froze. His driveway was being excavated. Massive digging equipment, operated by uniformed workers, was tearing into the earth, and in the midst of it all, Kerren was barking orders. "This is an expansion project," she declared loudly to a bewildered worker, her voice rising over the clamor of the machinery. "We need to modernize the community, no exceptions." The absurdity was evident. Ethan's driveway had never been earmarked for any such project. It was his private space, a part of a home he had built with love and sweat. Ethan's anger flared, but he knew that a direct confrontation in that moment could only worsen matters. Instead, he retreated to his study, where he gathered every document and piece of evidence he'd accumulated. Today, he decided, was the day he would make his move. With a calm determination that belied the storm raging inside him, he drafted a formal notice to the HOA, citing local property laws and zoning regulations that clearly stated the association had no authority to commandeer private driveways for community projects. When Kerren arrived at the next scheduled HOA meeting, she expected her usual display of power to go unchallenged. The meeting hall was filled with residents, many of whom wore expressions of apprehension mixed with cautious hope. As soon as the meeting was called to order, Ethan strode to the front of the room. Clutching a thick file of legal documents and photographic evidence, he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice steady, "what you witnessed this morning was not an expansion project. It was an illegal act. I have here the legal documentation and photos proving that the HOA has no jurisdiction over private property." A murmur ran through the crowd as he methodically laid out his evidence, detailing every step of Kerren's overreach. Kerren's confident veneer began to crumble. With each new document Ethan presented, board members shifted in their seats and exchanged uncertain glances. One member, normally reserved and compliant, even whispered, "This isn't right, we deserve better." The energy in the room changed dramatically. Residents who had long suffered in silence now found their voices. Ethan's confrontation was more than just a legal rebuttal. It was a public declaration that the HOA had overstepped its bounds. As he continued, he revealed the tactics Kerren had used: towing vehicles without warning, shutting off utilities as a form of punishment, and even threatening residents with bogus lawsuits. The evidence was irrefutable, and the room filled with murmurs of disbelief and anger. Kerren's response was hasty and defensive. "I am following the rules," she insisted, her voice cracking as she tried to reclaim control. "You are all misinterpreting standard procedures." But the tide had already turned. A few brave homeowners stood up, voicing their own grievances and recounting personal experiences of harassment. The community, once cowed into silence, was now united in outrage. By the time the meeting adjourned, it was clear that Kerren's authority was not absolute. The public exposure of the HOA's corruption had sown seeds of doubt among even her most loyal supporters. Though she continued to protest her innocence, the evidence, now in the hands of both the public and local legal advisors, was too strong to ignore. Ethan left the meeting with a mix of relief and grim determination. The battle was far from over, but he had struck a significant blow. In the wake of the confrontation, community members began to band together, planning meetings and discussions about how best to proceed legally and publicly. Kerren's extreme measures had backfired spectacularly, and the dominoes were now set to fall. That day, as Ethan walked home, he couldn't help but notice the changed expressions on his neighbors' faces. There was hope, a belief that they could reclaim their community from tyranny. Kerren's reign of arbitrary power was under threat, and Ethan knew that he had only just begun to turn the tide. In a last-ditch effort to salvage her crumbling power, Kerren decided that drastic measures were necessary. Not long after the explosive HOA meeting, a series of unexpected events rattled the neighborhood. Early one foggy morning, a siren wailed in the distance, growing louder until a police cruiser pulled up in front of Ethan's house. Kerren had called the police, claiming that Ethan's exuberant porch lights and his disruptive behavior were causing a public disturbance. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers arrived. Their presence brought a hushed tension over the neighborhood as Ethan, still in his robe and slippers, met them at his door. "I assure you," he began calmly, flashing his city official badge, "there's no disturbance here. Only a well-lit porch and a man exercising his right to personal expression." The officers exchanged looks. Kerren's call had been nothing more than a desperate cry for attention. Yet the damage was done. Whispers of an ongoing scandal circulated like wildfire. But Kerren wasn't done. In an attempt to regain control, she hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Ethan. Rumors began to circulate that the investigator was seen lurking around Ethan's property at odd hours, attempting to spy on his movements. It wasn't long before one of Ethan's security cameras, installed discreetly after the earlier incidents, captured clear footage of a shadowy figure skulking around his garage. The footage, when shown at a subsequent community meeting, was damning. The residents were appalled by the lengths to which Kerren would go, and many began to voice their support for Ethan more vocally than ever. At the next HOA gathering, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and outrage. Ethan, with a quiet air of triumph, set up his laptop to project the security footage onto a blank wall. The room fell silent as the grainy video showed the private investigator creeping around the premises, clearly violating the sanctity of a man's home. A chorus of gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as Ethan explained, "This is the measure of desperation we face, a leader who has stooped so low as to resort to spying on a citizen. This isn't about enforcing a rule. This is about personal vendetta." Kerren's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "That video is manipulated," she shouted, her voice cracking as she tried to discredit the evidence. But the room had already turned against her. Board members, now emboldened by the undeniable proof of her tactics, began to question every decision she had ever made. One resident even demanded an immediate independent investigation into the HOA's practices. Amidst the chaos, Kerren made one final desperate move. She stepped forward, insisting that Ethan's excesses had endangered the community's safety, and that only strict measures, such as involving the police and filing lawsuits, could restore order. But her words rang hollow in a room where evidence and reason had finally prevailed. The police, who had already dismissed her earlier complaint, made it clear that there was no legal basis for further action against Ethan. In a moment that was as symbolic as it was satisfying, Ethan calmly responded, "The only disturbance here is the disturbance you've created in our community's trust." His words, measured and resolute, echoed through the meeting hall and resonated with everyone present. Kerren's final gambit had not only failed, it had irreparably damaged her credibility. The humiliation was complete. In that room, with every piece of damning evidence laid bare, the community's support for Ethan was unanimous. Kerren's desperate measures had exposed her as nothing more than an entitled bully, unworthy of leadership, and entirely out of touch with the very people she claimed to serve. In the days following Kerren's televised debacle, the once feared HOA began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Homeowners, now galvanized by Ethan's unwavering stand, organized grassroots meetings in living rooms and community centers. Fueled by a newfound sense of empowerment, they rallied around the cause of transparency and fairness. The very institution designed to maintain order was now being dismantled from within. It wasn't long before the collective anger of the residents forced the city's hand. Local authorities launched an investigation into the HOA's practices, an inquiry that quickly uncovered a tangled web of misappropriated funds, false fines, and unauthorized actions. The revelations were damning. Kerren's personal accounts, her misuse of HOA resources for lavish personal expenses, and her unyielding intimidation tactics were laid out for all to see. At an emergency town hall meeting that drew an unusually large crowd, the community cast their votes in an unprecedented show of unity. The decision was clear and unanimous. Kerren was to be removed from her position as the de facto head of the HOA. The very board members who had once quietly supported her now found themselves facing legal consequences and the threat of public exposure. For the first time, the residents had reclaimed their power, and with it, the integrity of their neighborhood. In the days that followed, Kerren's life unraveled at a rapid pace. News broke that her personal finances were in shambles, a direct result of her misappropriation of HOA funds. Within hours, her home was listed for sale, and the board, now stripped of its power, was forced to issue a public apology. In a final humiliating twist of poetic justice, Ethan was seen enjoying his morning coffee on a fully restored porch. His lights shone proudly in the dawn, a symbol of victory and the reclaiming of his personal freedom. As word of the HOA's collapse spread, neighbors began to share their own stories of oppression and relief. Many spoke of minor infractions that had been enforced with an iron fist, now recognized for what they were, a means to control and subdue rather than protect. With Kerren's downfall, a new era dawned in the community, one where rules were applied fairly and residents' rights were respected. In a quiet moment of reflection, Ethan looked around at the neighborhood he had fought so hard to preserve. The victory wasn't just his. It belonged to every homeowner who had ever felt the sting of unjust fines and arbitrary decisions. And though the scars of the battle would remain for some time, there was a renewed sense of hope in the air. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression, was now a relic of the past. Kerren's reign, with all its entitlement and cruelty, was over. The community had not only reclaimed its space, it had also restored its dignity. With Kerren's ouster and the public revelations of her misdeeds, the fallout for the HOA was swift and severe. The city, now fully aware of the rampant abuse of power, imposed hefty fines on the association. An investigation revealed that the HOA had been operating without proper legal authority on multiple fronts. Lawsuits were filed by outraged residents, and even some of the former board members found themselves facing legal challenges for their complicity in the mismanagement of community funds. Ethan, still resolute and determined, became the catalyst for change. He rallied his neighbors to file a class action lawsuit against the HOA. The legal process was grueling and complex, but every piece of evidence, the fabricated fines, the illegal inspections, and Kerren's personal enrichment at the expense of the community, served to strengthen their case. Public sentiment was firmly on their side. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the scandal spread beyond the neighborhood, capturing the attention of local media and civic leaders alike. In court, the evidence was undeniable. The judge, citing numerous violations of property rights and administrative abuse, handed down a ruling that not only dissolved the HOA, but also mandated severe penalties for its past actions. Kerren's lawyer, once so confident in his ability to manipulate the system, found himself under investigation by the state bar for his role in orchestrating these abuses. In a final power move, Ethan accepted a modest settlement on behalf of the homeowners, a token of justice that symbolized the community's hard-won victory over an institution that had long run amok. This legal reckoning marked the end of an era of corruption and the beginning of a new chapter for the community, one defined by transparency, accountability, and a renewed respect for the rights of individual homeowners. As the legal consequences unfolded, Kerren's personal life crumbled around her. Once seen as the unstoppable force behind the HOA, she was now the subject of public ridicule and scorn. Her house, once a symbol of her self-imposed authority, was hastily put on the market. Rumors circulated that her lavish lifestyle was financed by funds that were never meant for personal gain, and soon, the community's disdain was palpable. In a final act of poetic justice, Ethan encountered Kerren unexpectedly on a chilly morning while he was driving through the neighborhood. There she was, standing outside a modest rental property she now called home, a stark contrast to the grandeur she had once flaunted. As she fumbled with her keys and wore an expression of defeat, Ethan couldn't help but offer a quiet, knowing smile. "I hope you like following the rules," he remarked, his tone light yet laced with the satisfaction of long overdue justice. That brief exchange marked the end of an era. Kerren's reputation, her finances, and her very identity had been irreparably tarnished. Even her closest allies had abandoned her, leaving her isolated and forced to confront the consequences of her actions. Public humiliation, legal battles, and the loss of her once powerful status left her with no choice but to face the reality of her downfall. Sometime after the dust had settled, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, a peaceful coexistence where residents felt truly heard and respected. Ethan's porch, once the battleground for a bitter conflict, had transformed into a symbol of resilience and hope. Neighbors gathered for impromptu barbecues, shared stories of past grievances, and now looked forward to a future free from arbitrary fines and intimidation. In the twilight of an ordinary day, Ethan sat on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The familiar glow of his lights punctuated the soft evening, a quiet reminder of a hard-fought victory. As he relaxed, a friend strolled by holding an old, printed HOA notice, a relic of a bygone era. With a laugh, the friend handed it to Ethan and said, "For old time's sake, one last violation notice, just for the irony." Ethan's eyes twinkled as he examined the faded paper. They really tried, he murmured with a wry smile. The joke wasn't lost on the assembled group of neighbors. Their laughter and camaraderie stood as a living testament to the power of community when united against injustice. In that moment, it was clear that the true victory wasn't just in the downfall of an entitled tyrant. It was in the collective reclamation of a neighborhood's dignity and spirit. The echoes of Kerren's failed attempts at control were replaced by genuine smiles and heartfelt conversations about rebuilding trust and forging a better future. As the screen faded to black, the final image lingered, a community reborn, where every light shone in defiance of oppressive rules, and where one man's unwavering stand had sparked a movement of change. It was a mic drop moment, a reminder that when entitlement meets unity, justice will always prevail.